and welcome to the Hamilton Education test review video for our test 300. This is our PSAT, but with the digital SAT, there is actually no difference between the PSAT and the SAT whatsoever in terms of the test. However, there is a difference in the scale and the scoring. So your scores will look a little different from this test than they will from the typical SATs you'll see from the College Board or from us. But nonetheless, the questions are exactly the same. They're the exact same number of questions per module, per type. Everything is exactly the same as your typical SAT, except your score is going to just look a little lower. So with that, that's what we're going to be working on. We'll do both modules 1 and 2. The reading and writing sections are combined. So we'll have about 15-ish questions of reading per module, about 12-ish questions of writing per module, give or take a question or two per module. So with that, we'll go into the questions. We'll review every single question, the correct answer, many of the incorrect answers or distractors, as we call them, and better prepare you for the upcoming tests. I think this is a pretty challenging test, but it's a fair one as well. With that, we'll move into the question. Okay, so question 1 here is the first of our word and context questions. It's a vocab question, ultimately. This question is replicating a very common error or tricky thing that the College Board provides for us on the SAT, which is a bunch of words with similar definitions, but slightly different uses. Okay, so it's talking about collaborations between native communities and the national park system. In recent years, the national park system has sought partnerships with native communities to allow for indigenous something of the land, which the NPS sees as integral to their primary goal. So then we see two things. Okay, so the primary goal means preserving the natural and cultural resources. Talking about conservation here. All right. So what we are looking to replicate is that there is native leadership, and that leadership is leading towards a preservation or conservation of the natural and cultural resources. All right. So custody is probably the hardest distractor here, because custody means ownership, right? Or guidance, custody of children or what have you. But the conservation element that has to do with natural and cultural resources is not connoted by custody in the same way that our correct answer, stewardship, does. Stewardship has a direct, what we would call idiomatic link to natural conservation, resources of nature, things like that. All right, so custody means ownership and guidance, but it doesn't have the same connotation that stewardship does. Regulation would mean kind of control and governance, but again, regulation could be for banks, it could be for all sorts of things, where stewardship has a particular focus on conserving resources or preserving something for future, right? So a steward is somebody who would maybe rule a country waiting for the return of, say, a monarch who's off fighting in like the Crusades or something in the past. Finally, institution. If you're instituting the land, that would mean you're like putting it together, like putting it in, rather than like a governing body. So that doesn't really work there. So stewardship is our best word, even though it's very similar to a lot of these words. It's the only word that meets the particular connotation, the particular idiomatic use we're looking for in question 1. Okay, so question 2 on module 1 of test 300 has a very similar difficulty as question 1. Why? It has the same sort of error or trick that the SAT has been doing lately, which is they have a lot of words with similar definitions, but different idiomatic uses, meaning they're used to mean different things, though they all have a very similar overall definition. The same way you might say that someone is frugal when you're looking to say they're sensibly conserving their money, that someone is like cheap or perhaps yeah, like cheap is probably the best word when you're trying to say like they're preserving their money without any real reason, right? They both mean preserve money, but one means kind of a positive way, the other is kind of negative. We have the same sort of thing here where many of these words have similar meanings, but they have different use cases. All right. So when we read the whole context of this, and it's a given that you've read this, seeing that you're watching this video, it means you've taken this test. We see economic prospects of the region, right, based off of lithium. Okay, so we are talking specifically about money. All right. All of these mean something along the lines of like benefits, right? Lucrative. If something is lucrative, it's providing you benefits. If something is rewarding, it's providing you benefits. Uh, Promising means it's likely to provide you benefits, so that's a little bit less uh, plausible. And then overwhelming just means too much of something, right? Overwhelming is a classic error distractor in that it fits. It sounds good in the sentence, the discovery of potentially overwhelming reserves of lithium. That doesn't sound wrong, but it doesn't have the meaning of being kind of remunerative or like providing a benefit. Promising also, again, it fits. It sounds good in the context, potentially promising reserves. But promising how, we don't really know. It's not clarified. It's not as good, ultimately, as lucrative or rewarding. Now, why is lucrative better than rewarding? Rewarding means it will be benefits, but there are many ways that rewarding can be beneficial. You can have, a rewarding experience, right? Meaning you have a good memory from something. You can have a rewarding interaction or conversation where you learn something, right? But if something is lucrative, lucrative has this specific idiomatic context and meaning of money, right? Economics. That was a lucrative offer. It was a lucrative decision. It got me money, right? Which is what we're focusing on here by seeing economic. So rewarding isn't bad. Ultimately, if you chose rewarding, you're on the right path. But lucrative has that better particular definition, which is why it's the correct answer. If you're missing a question like this, I'm assuming that you know what rewarding means, you know what promising means, you know what overwhelming means. You're kind of iffy on what lucrative means, and you're choosing something like rewarding because it kind of works, but it doesn't work as well as lucrative, which is why you got to study vocabulary. So with question 3 here on module 1 of test 300, we see an error or a difficulty that is common to many SAT word and context vocabulary questions. It's the same kind of difficulty or same kind of error that we see in questions 1 and 2, in that we have multiple words, which all have relatively similar overall or general meanings, but their connotations and their idiomatic uses are different. All right. Gap, salve, rebut, and reprieve. Okay, a gap means, a break. A salve means kind of like, something like soothing, right? But it can sometimes mean a break. To rebut means to go against something. And then to reprieve means, or to have a reprieve is even more than just, it's like a nice break, right? So it's break. Okay. But when we talk about a gap as a break, right? Gap doesn't really fit here because it means a different type of break, right? If you have a gap in your unemployment, it means a break from your working, but it's just sort of like an empty space, right? It doesn't mean anything sort of restful. But reprieve means restful. It means it's giving you something, right? It's like a vacation. Okay, and you see that here. We see welcome, beneficial, break, right? So reprieve fits perfectly in that context. Now, salve means kind of the same thing as like welcome or beneficial. It's like a band-aid, but it doesn't mean break in the same way that reprieve or gap does. And then rebut just doesn't really fit here whatsoever, right? If you're rebutting something, it's usually like disagreeing or finding kind of like a strong argument against something. So if you're missing a question like this, I presume you are finding the right kind of word here, but your vocabulary is just keeping you from knowing that reprieve is a better form of break than gap is. Gap is sort of like a physical break, right? Like there was a gap between the sidewalk and the street. It's physical, empty space. Whereas reprieve is like a restful, mental, physical sort of break, like a vacation. So with question 4 here, we have a lot of really good clues that are pointing towards our best word. I want to remind us, this is something that we always want to think about when it comes to word and context. We want to know if it fits, like it sounds good there. We also want to make sure it fits the meaning of the sentence, right? And anything else that shows us meaning. So I want to show you something that fits but doesn't have the right meaning. Profound, right? Can dialogue be delivered as profound statements, right? Can dialogue be defined by profound statements? Absolutely, right? It sounds good in there, but so does witty, right? Doesn't witty sound good in there? Can't dialogue be incredibly witty as well? Yes, right? Dialogue can kind of be ineffable. Ineffable means like hard to define or like something that we can't really put into words, right? There's an ineffable beauty in a sunset, something that's hard to say. And so that one doesn't really work here. But witty and profound both could fit. And so could terse, right? Terse meaning short, right? To the point. When something's terse, you're really keeping it short and to the point, right? So all of these could fit. All these could describe a type of dialogue or statements in a type of dialogue. But only one of these fits the rest of the context there, meaning it has the right meaning. Only one of these has the right meaning, which is terse. Why? Terse aligns with this word, laconic, which comes from the Spartans, meaning they say something very short and to the point, right? Kind of in a, sort of deep and interesting way, right? But it's usually just very short and to the point. They're not doing what I'm doing here, where you over-explain something, right? They're not like me at all. Short and to the point. We also see that it is properly the opposite of the rest, right? Verbose, unremittingly verbose means it's just overwhelming, right? Too many words. What I'm doing now is verbose. You're giving too much explanation. So there is a kind of juxtaposition, right? Very, very wordy in his descriptions of scenery, but very short and to the point in his dialogue, right? This has the right meaning here. Whereas nowhere in this passage do we see, right? Because contrast, okay? Nowhere in this passage do we see anything that suggests profundity is what we have in these statements, or wittiness is something we have in these statements. The only one that directly points to the thing we need to say is terse. All right, so question 5 here is kind of one of those questions where if you don't know the vocabulary words, you're going to be a little lost, right? There are a few words in here which I think are pretty common knowledge, right? Benefit, clearly a big common knowledge word, right? We all know what benefit means. It's a good, positive thing. We see a root bene, meaning good, coming from Latin. We see the word intricate. That usually is a word that we kind of understand the meaning of. Intricate is when something is kind of like very interwoven in a way that is sophisticated, right? Or it requires kind of a lot of sophistication to make sense of, right? So watches are famously intricate. So would a clock or a old-fashioned lock and key, right? These sort of things which have an inner working that rely on all these interconnected layers, right? These are both words that we probably kind of understood, right? But then we see words nebulous and nexus, right? So when something is nebulous, it's hard to know what it is. Okay, so it's like a nebula in space, perhaps you would know, meaning it's kind of like a cloud, right? When something is nebulous, it's hard to define, hard to say because it's too kind of murky and expansive. Meanwhile, a nexus is a noun, which is to mean kind of like a interconnected, linked network, right? It's different from intricate, right? Nexus would be like a neural network, right? Neural networks are intricate, but it is a nexus, right? So the difference as well is that nexus is working as a noun, whereas intricate typically works as an adjective, all right? So if you don't know what nebulous or nexus mean, you could probably have a hard time working through this, all right? So always study your vocab. Nexus is our correct word here, right? Because it means interconnected kind of thing, right? It's a network, right? They were part of a far-flung network of exchange, a far-flung trade network, right? It works perfectly. It has the fit and it has the correct meaning, right? An intricate of exchange, a nebulous of exchange, a benefit of exchange. None of those really work because they kind of are just honestly the wrong word type, right? For the most part, many of these are adjectives as opposed to nouns fitting there. So I think there's a way you can stumble upon the correct answer if you know what at least three of these are, but you don't know what nexus is. Always use your deductive process of elimination, right? We've been doing it since we're 6, 7 years old. It's still the best approach for these questions. But if you're missing questions like this, you're going to need to be studying your vocab. We have vocabulary for you. We have it on Quizlet. We have it in paper. We have all these different ways for you to study vocabulary. But ultimately, we don't have enough time in classes or in tutoring to go over every word you need to know. You're going to have to commit to making that happen. Nexus is in your vocab list, right? Study them. You're going to get this question correct. All right, question 6 here is our final vocab question for module 1 for this test 300. It's also, I would say, the hardest vocab words on module 1 and perhaps the test as a whole. However, or the answer choice is the kind of the hardest vocab word. However, I don't think that this is the hardest question to arrive to the correct answer. Why? I think our process of elimination, our deductive reasoning should lead us to the correct answer even if we don't know what the correct answer means. Right? So if you're choosing infertile here or infertile, all right, you're making a mistake. Okay. Just because sandy and unproductive is here, right? Formerly, we're looking for the opposite, right? Meaning we're looking for the opposite of sandy and unproductive. Infertile equals sandy and unproductive. That's not what we want. We want something that's exactly the opposite. So infertile doesn't work, right? Opulent. Opulent's a little bit too weird here, right? If we know what opulent means, it means something that's kind of extravagant, showy, right? A rich person in the 1700s might have an opulent house with lots of famous paintings and suits of armor and all this crazy kind of rich people stuff, right? That's what opulent means. It's over the top, nice, fancy, kind of, it's almost cringe because it's so nice. Do we describe soil in that way? Certainly not, right? Or not typically. Finally, abundant. Abundant kind of makes sense here, right? You might be like, abundant soil, there's a lot of it, right? But the soil still exists. It's just that its fertility is gone, right? There still is dirt, but the dirt just isn't good anymore. So if you were thinking, like abundant soil, soil is like good dirt. And then if it's not soil anymore, once it's turned into something else, once it's lost its fertility, that's probably why you selected C. But the real reason you probably selected C is because you don't know what this word fecund means, right? Or fecund. That word is ultimately a word that we have in our vocab lists, right? But fecund is like not a very common word used in the English language anymore. I've honestly pronounced it, I think, 2 or 3 different ways just now because I've only ever really seen it written. I don't hear people saying this word very often in the world, right? But it is a word we've heard used before, right? It's a word that, is kind of a famous SAT style word. Means fertility, means something being really fertile, particularly soils, right? Agricultural, right? You could say like the San Pasqual Valley is fecund, right? You could say that, the Central Valley used to be until it's been destroyed. So if you've done our vocab lists, if you've been studying your vocab somewhere in the world, you'll have seen this word and you'll get this question correct. If you haven't, this will be something that you're going to struggle with, right? These highest level SAT vocab questions are going to typically be like that. It's going to be a word you probably just don't know unless you've learned a lot of words. But you can maybe arrive to the correct answer with good process of elimination, logical rigor. But with that, that's all of Module 1's vocab questions, and we move on from there. All right, so question 7 here on Module 1 is asking about the overall structure of a text. All right, so we want to make sure that we are engaging with how this thing is set up. There's a couple different common structures, but we just want to figure this out, all right? So what do we see here? We get the Cobra effect, which is a piece of jargon or technical language described and defined, all right? And then, so we see, what is the Cobra effect? It's where we're also called perverse incentives. When you incentivize something and the opposite comes to be. All right. So there was the example then is now provided, right? So what's an example? The kind of like archetypical example, right? The earliest one. You got a bounty for dead cobras because the British wanted to get rid of cobras. However, now all of a sudden a bunch of people start growing cobras to kill them later and sell them back to the British. We've seen the British doing this over and over again. All right, they did it again in 2002, when they paid people for destroying poppy farms. So guess what people started doing? They started making poppy farms. All right, so what do we have here? We define a phenomenon, right? We define a piece of jargon or a piece of, technical language. Then we give the archetypical example, right? Like the thing that named it. Perfect. And then a more recent example right here, right? So that is why C is correct. It does define a phenomenon, right, of perverse incentives, then gives the classic example and newer one. Right, some of these other ones are almost like baggage distractors, or we're getting a little too fine here. So A, it introduces a claim. All right, well, we introduce something, but is it a claim? Do we say this is something that might exist? I don't know if it's a claim, right? And then extensive evidence supported, that seems to be the wrong sort of structure here, right? A claim is something that you can disagree with. This is just defining it. B, is this kind of true in that it does talk about colonization and it does give examples of similar things in the future? I don't know. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. Just because it talks about colonization doesn't mean that this is discussing the consequences of colonization. And finally, D, it gives a problem. Okay, that's, maybe true. It gives examples of the problem before. Now, here's the part that's weird. Offering a solution to the problem. All right. So always be deductive. Find things that make something wrong. If answer choice has anything wrong with it, get rid of it. All right. So question 8 is asking us ultimately to describe the function of an underlined sentence in the overall structure. Okay. So the example I've given in class, in tutoring, is when we think of a car, right? A car engine. If you were to ask, what is the function of an engine? What is the function of an engine in a car? You have to look at the car as a whole in order to understand that function. If you're just looking at the engine itself, you're going to think, oh, this is supposed to produce heat, right? It gets really hot. But why does that matter? Why is that important for cars? Well, it provides the energy that makes a car move forward. You have to look at the whole thing. So you've read this. I know you have because you're watching this video, you've taken this test. Right here we see established in 1988, Clairefontaine is an academy which admits 13-year-olds from the densely populated Ile-de-France region, including many immigrant communities brimming with talented young footballers who may not have had the economic resources to ardently pursue the sport and therefore never contributed to French football, right? Basically, we, as a structure of the passage as a whole, right, we say France used to suck at soccer, right? Sucked back before 98. They didn't even get to the World Cup in that at all. And now they're one of the best World Cup nations, right? We are, what gave this turnaround? Well, Clairefontaine, all right? Then we get a little bit more. What does Clairefontaine do? It continues to offer an opportunity for athletes so that they can dedicate themselves to football, or what we would call soccer. And we've seen some really good football players from there. Henry, Mbappe, come from this academy. Okay. So In order to make sense of what's going on here, we need to see the whole thing. All right. So, does B give examples of ways that youth benefit from the Ile-de-France? Yes. Right. But was this a passage about the problems of Ile-de-France and youth opportunities there? No, this passage is about French football in Clairefontaine. Okay. A, does this passage clarify the impact that Clairefontaine has had on French football? Yeah, probably. But does this connect to this sentence? Not directly, right? So no. D, does there a commentary here? I wouldn't say so, right? Do we see an increasing in opportunities for working class immigrant communities? Yes, we do. But is there a commentary on how this is important, something we all should be doing, right? Finally, D, it provides or C, it provides a definition, right? Okay, we find out what it is. Exactly, it's an academy. Good. And it describes the social and athletic problems which the academy helps to solve, all right? So what's the social problem? That there's many people who are struggling economically. What's the football problem? Well, the best players and the best athletes are not able to play football and soccer before Clairefontaine. All right. So we get a social athletic problem. All parameters are covered in C. All right. Remember, if you're answering questions like this and missing them, you want to make sure that you're, one, considering the structure as a whole, considering the argument as a whole, and two, understanding what this particular thing is doing, right? For A, that's the passage as a whole, but not this particular sentence. For B, that's this sentence, but that doesn't have to do with the whole passage. So that's why we get to see. All right, so question 9 here is another question asking about kind of like, what is a text doing? In this case, we're asking main idea. All right, so I know you've all read this, okay? But I want to point out where the main idea is clarified as opposed to just the topic, right? The Totoaba is a topic. That there was a demise is a topic, right? That there was a lucrative market because their nearest relative was already hunted to extinction in China, is a topic, right? But none of these are the main claim of this passage, right? This is what Totoaba, but is that the main claim? No. What is the claim, right? Right here. This is the claim. Okay, so everything leads up to this main idea and is all necessary to find the main idea. But this is most important, right? Which is ultimately that the Totoaba population needs to come back. And in order to come back, we need to reduce overfishing, which is one of the things why they struggle, but also the damming and diversion of the Colorado River has disrupted their habitat, right? So they were overfished and their habitat was lost. In order to resurrect the population, we must do both, right? So if you missed this question, it is highly likely that you focused on only one of those things, right? For example, A. Is A true? Is A true in the passage? Yes, it is true in the passage. But is that the main idea? No, the main idea is about how to get them back. Is B true in the passage? Yes, it is another true but irrelevant distractor because it doesn't answer the question. It is true to the passage, but it is not the main idea. C, this is too extreme of a distractor, right? It isn't saying that overfishing doesn't matter. It's saying that overfishing isn't the only thing, but it does matter. Finally, D is basically restating this claim right here, right? We cannot solely focus on overfishing or restoring habitat, but must focus on both, right? That is a restatement of our main claim. It's very related to our main idea. That's why we arrived to D. All right, so question 10, we get a little bit of a literary term. We need to know a little bit of vocabulary. What is a paradox? All right, a paradox is something that shouldn't be possible, but is. All right. Um, we have examples of paradox all the time in our lives. Some good examples is that you know uh the only rule is there are no rules, right? Um that doesn't make any sense. Okay. Um uh the more you know, the more you know that you don't know, right? The kind of paradox of ignorance, right? So this idea that like the more you know something, the more you realize you know very little, right? Or the less I know, the more I think I know, right? Those are paradoxes, okay? So what is the paradox in this passage? So we read this interesting, fairly pretty poem, right? Um, and we see this paradox right here. There is no room for a lack of trust or trust, right? There's no room for either, right? Um, so that is paradoxical, right? You're so overcome with emotion, you can't find either. None of the rest of these are really paradoxes, right? B, the moon is able to put a pitcher of water and flames in the center of the room, right? A pitcher of water and flames might seem like paradoxical next to one another, but I think many of us have maybe drank water next to a fire before. It's possible. Okay. That is more of imagery or a metaphor. Um, uh, this is not a paradox, right? That everybody has a role doesn't mean it's paradoxical. It's just true, right? And this isn't a paradox either. So if we know what a paradox is, this question's pretty easy to arrive to see. All right, question 11 is what we would call a command of evidence quantitative question. These throw a lot of students for a loop, but a lot of times they're more straightforward than we might expect. Some things we want to look out for, be on the lookout for. Sometimes we'll see a answer that really would be good for the passage, but doesn't correctly use the data. We see this all the time, right? An example would be B, right? If you've read this passage, which you did, it makes the claim ultimately that we have seen a big increase in Tommy John surgeries, which are surgeries that repair the ulnar collateral ligament in the elbow after it's been injured. We've seen an increase in this surgery type among American baseball pitchers following an increase in velocity, a prioritization of velocity. So, so the claim, what we want to do, right, is say that, the more we throw hard and fast, the more we see damage to the UCL, the ulnar collateral ligament. And if B were true, right, that'd be a pretty good argument, right? That the highest number of Tommy John surgeries come from the group with 97 plus. But is that true? No, 36 is not the highest number. All right, so that's a classic distractor type that we want to look out for on these command of evidence quantitative, right? Something that makes sense, but isn't true actually by the data. Okay, so we want to show a positive relationship, meaning the harder you throw, the more likely you have a repair in your UCL, right? So A is an opposite distractor, right? That would not describe a positive relationship, rather a negative or inverse relationship. And then D is true, right? But is that relevant here? No, right? Because we just have different sample sizes, so they can't even really be compared. And we're looking to show an opposite. So C is correct. There's nothing wrong with C. Let's talk about why C is correct, right? So going up, right? The percentage of Tommy John goes up with each interval going up, right? Pretty much. Now there's a little bit of like a little right here, but going from 89 to 92 to 92 to 95 to 95 to 96 to 97 plus, the percentage of those receiving this surgery increases with every interval. That's perfect. Way to go, C. All right, so 12 is what we would call a command of evidence qualitative question. All right, so this is a question going into, or textual, not qualitative, textual. It's not quantitative, surely. We don't have specific data in a figure or a graph like we do for quantitative questions. Rather, we're basing off of the text. So what does the text say, right? What would most directly weaken support for Bergmann's rules or questions? So we have to understand what Bergmann's rule is, right? Bergmann's rule states, I'm simplifying this for you. If you read this and you didn't understand this, follow along. I'm simplifying it. It states that the colder it gets, the bigger the body size is of animals. That means also that the higher up you go in latitude or altitude, right? So the closer you go to the poles, right? Or the higher up a mountain you go, the bigger you get. All right. So we want to see something that goes against this, right? So what we have here is a inverse relationship between temperature and size, right? Size is going up, right? And as size goes up, temp goes down, right? Or vice versa, right? So every time it gets colder, body sizes increase across like, you know, a general family, okay? So why is A weak in this, okay? A positive correlation means as one thing goes up, another thing goes up. So A suggests that as temperature goes up in dinosaurs, size goes up, right? As temperature goes up in the world at that time, the size of dinosaurs increases, right? A positive relationship between temperature and size is the exact opposite of Bergmann's rule. So A is correct, but let's see why other things are wrong here, right? B supports Bergmann's rule, right? So if we're not catching this word weaken, we might think, B is perfect because it supports this claim. C also supports this claim, right? So B and C are both the kind of same type of distractor here. What's tricky about D to me is that I feel like this is a kind of a baggage distractor, right? We might think, oh, now extinct members of the elephant family, right? Things from the past. We're talking about the Ice Age here, huh? Right? Are smaller than contemporary African elephants. You might be thinking, oh, it has to be this because we have older, during colder era elephants, smaller than current warmer era African elephants, right? They live in Africa. It has to be really hot there. But a few things. One, you're making a leap of logic that is not supported in this answer choice or in this text, right? Nowhere does answer choice D mention temperature. You're inferring that out of baggage, meaning something that you know before, right? But that's not a safe inference. There's nothing in the text that says specifically we're dealing with temperature here, right? A does that directly though. So you have to know what positively correlated means, which is something that the SAT presumes you will know, right? So that's why we have A for question 12 here, a command of evidence textual. All right, so question 13 here for module 1 is another command of evidence quantitative question. All right, so we want to make sure that the answer choice we select aligns with both what we're looking for in the passage and something true from our figure. All right, so we want to support Richard West's findings. We know you read this, right? So what was his finding? It is that highly educated people are particularly vulnerable to mental mistakes while problem solving because they are biased to believe their reasoning is correct. Okay. So this bias that their reasoning is correct stands in the way of their kind of like ability to accurately judge whether they are making mental mistakes or not. All right, so where do we see this? Okay, how does the graph show this? So with our years of education, as we increase total years of education, confidence goes up, right? That's kind of the line of best fit for confidence, right? Confidence is going up with each additional year of education, right? A high school graduate has this much confidence. Their confidence is really close to what they get correct. And then by the time you've had another 14 years of college education, for some godforsaken reason, you've decided to do that. You are no more likely to be correct. In fact, your performance is either the same or lower on these kind of common questions as they would have been when you graduated high school, but you're a lot more likely to think you were correct, right? So your confidence goes up a lot. You think you're going to get more than 30 correct, and your performance doesn't change. So B describes that perfectly, right? The most educated people did not do any better than those who just graduated high school, but they were like in the most highly confident of any group, right? This is why these people are annoying. So a few things that show distractors, right? So did 18 years of education do better than 12 years of education? Yes, but significantly higher, right? Despite having much higher confidence. That doesn't support this claim. C weakens, or C doesn't really connect to the claim at all, right? Because this is about confidence. This isn't about doing well, right? So even though they performed the same, there's no invocation of confidence. So without confidence being talked about, C isn't a possible answer choice. And then finally with D, while it is true that confidence has increased a lot for 18 and 26, there's no indication of whether their performance, right? So we need both parameters, performance and confidence. We need to connect them to show that as education increases, it doesn't improve in performance, but it does increase confidence. All right, the only one that does both those parameters and really understands this experiment is answer choice B. So question 14 here on module 1 is a command of evidence textual question, meaning we're going to find evidence in our text to have some sort of relationship with a claim. All right, so we're looking to support the claim made by the folklorist's professor, or folkloristics professor, right? What is that? That's the study of folklore. All right, so where do we find this folklore professor's claim? All right, well, we see here that Valdemar Hafstein, the professor, believes that at least half of Icelanders believe in elves. All right, so this is about the whether Icelandic people believe in elves and all this sort of stuff, right? So ultimately, the claim is that this is a common sustained belief, right? And we see this claim here. If this was just one crazy lady talking about invisible friends, it's really easy to laugh about that. But we've talked about this for a long time. It's part of the nation, right? It's part of a tradition. So A is probably the hardest distractor because it's an opposite distractor that reads like a positive distractor, right? In one poll from 2022, only 9% of Icelanders said they thought claims of elves weren't entirely dubious. Right? So we have a bunch of double negatives here. It's kind of logically curious. What does A really say? How might we translate this to be more kind of easily understood? Only 9% of Icelanders thought elves could possibly be in volcanic habitats, right? That's the case, that undermines the claim that this isn't a crazy or uncommon point of view, right? again. We're looking for something to say that they at least attain it. All right. This is what supports the claim because it says that this notion of belief in elves is something that has gone on for a very long time. It's a part of the nation. It's a part of belief, and therefore it's still commonplace, right? B is a more clear opposite distractor, right? And then C is kind of irrelevant. Okay, so D is the only one which supports the idea that in Iceland, belief in elves is actually not crazy. It's relatively commonplace and is a belief that's existed for a very long time. So question 15 is our final reading type question on the first module of this practice SAT. We have an inference question, meaning we need to understand the logic of this passage. Okay? This word here, however, a pivot, is really important to understand. So new research from UPenn directly refutes this claim. So we need to know what this claim is. This claim is the classical economics sort of delusion that if you raise the minimum wage, it will induce a decrease in employment in that sector, right? So raising wages, minimum wage, will mean less people are employed in that, right? However, research from the UPenn shows that that is directly refutes that. So we need basically the opposite, right? So what we need to see is an answer choice which says, as wage goes up, employment goes up, right? Rather than the classical economics delusion of wage goes up, employment goes down. So C does that, right? We need to know what a positive correlation is here. We need to make sense of that, right? Positive correlation means that when one thing goes up, another thing goes up as well. So C is correct. And by the way, this is totally true. This has been seen in a lot of other studies, if you're curious. Just so happened to have a kind of natural study in California where minimum wage was increased in a particular labor market. So that's the only one which fulfills the kind of parameters we need here for the logic. If you're missing this question, you're probably missing this, however, or you have a baggage distractor, right? You've watched one too many kind of like neoliberal capitalist YouTube videos that, you know, kind of made you believe something which is untrue. And therefore you're selecting an answer choice which aligns with your beliefs. That's a baggage distractor. That's the kind of, you know, dumb mistake that students make to get wrong questions on this test. There are other ways you could have got this question wrong as well, though. You know, maybe not knowing exactly what a positive correlation is could step in the way. This is kind of like a distractor in terms of it's irrelevant, but like you know, consumer goods, what are these? We have a ton of jargon, we have a ton of technical language. These things are designed by the SAT, who again, College Board are evil people, to throw students off, right? They're supposed to confound you, make you wonder what on earth is going on. So the only one that's correct here is C, but if you missed it, you're likely making a baggage distractor, or you're just bewildered by the number of technical terms, the amount of jargon that we see in a passage like this, which the SAT really exploits to make you make mistakes. All right, so question 16 here on module 1 is our first grammar question on the test. This is what the test will call form, function, and sense. But for me, this is all about what tense are we in? What tense do we need to find here? So we need to think about what is the difference between these auxiliary verbs, conjugations of these auxiliary verbs? So what is an auxiliary verb? This, these had versus, yeah, these hads here, right? Ultimately, if you've been in tutoring or you've been working with us over the summer, you've received some form of a tense table, memorizing exactly what those tense table tense names are is maybe not the most necessary or essential thing to do. Though it would definitely be helpful if you want to commit that to memory, but present perfect progressive versus present perfect, right? Knowing exactly what those names mean isn't maybe the most important thing in the world, but knowing that the way we see those, right? For example, I have been walking versus I have walked, right? Knowing the or I have been a teacher versus I have been teaching or I have taught, right? For however many years, knowing that these have subtle differences in the way they appear and in the way that they are used is important. All right. Knowing the differences between these tenses rather than the official tense name is probably where I want us focusing. So here we have basically we want to show what is the oldest kind of action that takes place in this story that was being inspired by gardens depicted by Japanese prints that were once collected, right? So that's going to be the first thing in this list because it's the first thing in the past, right? We want to use what we call the past perfect, right? Past perfect is when you say, I had blank, right? So options A and C are perfect in terms of their tense. All right. B and D make the mistake of suggesting that Monet is beginning his overhaul of his garden earlier in the chronology of this story than other things, right? So since sometimes ask me like, oh, are tenses based on the order of the way they appear in a sentence? It's not the order in which they appear in a sentence, though that can be related, because what it is tied to is the order of when things take place in the chronology or the timeline of a story. All right, so timeline-wise, the inspiration from the Japanese prince comes before when he began an overhaul of his garden. Now, between A and C, you'll see, don't these look exactly the same? Well, we have commas versus semicolon, right? So the semicolon in C is wrong because we do not have independent clause beginning our sentence, right? Inspired by the gardens depicted in Japanese prints he had collected, so we call it dependent clause. When we have dependent clauses, we connect with just a comma like we see in A. So A is our best option here as a result. All right, so question 17 here is all about number. All right, meaning what case are we? Do we have a singular or a plural subject for this verb? Right, so it's a subject-verb agreement based on number. One thing the SAT will commonly do is throw different options or like kind of confusing language between the actual subject of our sentence, which is here a species, and where the verb appears here, right? So we have all of this in between right here, like the dodo bird once did, which can kind of throw us off on what is the actual subject for our verb. Additionally, we see a thing, species, which seems like it could be plural and is plural, right? We don't say the species is, right? We say many species of bird are flightless, right? So species can be plural or it can be singular depending on what we see. All right. But we don't want to say inhabit, right? Which would mean that our subject was plural just because we think species is plural, right? We see here a species, one which, right? These both suggest we are in a singular situation. Now, we also are wondering, are we in a present tense or a past tense? What tense are we in here? So here we see is, right? Is present. That means we want to keep it present, right? Would inhabit puts us firmly in the subjunctive, right? But this isn't hypothetical. This is the archetype of a species prone to extinction. And then inhabited would put us in the past tense. If we're talking about the dodo bird, that would make sense. But remember, the dodo bird is not our subject. It is the archetype of a species prone to extinction. That is our subject, which has is, meaning present tense, singular, therefore D, inhabits. All right, so if you missed 18, I'm thinking you probably thought that this question was more complicated than it actually was, which is kind of typical of an SAT question that this looks like we're considering a lot. It looks like there's a lot going on here, but in fact, there really isn't. All right, so what we have is we have adjectives describing a noun, right? So a sprawling hilltop campus overlooking Los Angeles. All right. So we would never want to put, and that makes it kind of difficult to see, so I'm going to erase that. We would never want to put a comma between an adjective and a noun, right? So we do want to put our commas between our adjectives here, right? Because each adjective describes campus, right? Sprawling doesn't describe the hilltop. Sprawling describes the campus. Okay, so we would want to say a sprawling and hilltop campus, right? It's on top of the hill and it goes as far as it wants to. It's rambling, right? So we want to have a comma between our two adjectives. So we don't have that in A, but we never want to put a comma between our adjective and our noun, right? So that means we can get rid of B. Now looking at C and D, we're saying, oh, weird, you know, we don't have a comma between campus here. Honestly, maybe the hilltop could be sprawling, like this is possible, but when you look at C, there's a different error here. Why would we not want a semicolon? Well, because a sprawling hilltop campus overlooking Los Angeles is a non-essential phrase, right? It's describing the Getty Center, but we don't need it for this whole sentence, which would be just, in 1997, the Getty Center opened to the public and became the new home of Getty's private collections, right? That's all we need, okay? So that means that everything between A and Los Angeles is not necessary, which means it has to be in a pair of commas. Putting it with a semicolon there suggests that we have an independent clause, which we don't to start. So that is why it is D. Just be deductive, right? Or yeah, so find something that's wrong with an answer choice, hunt for what's wrong in answer choices rather than what's right, and then get rid of anything that is wrong whatsoever. If an answer choice has a little bit wrong with it, it's not good enough for this test. All right, so question 19 here is one that in many ways appears very difficult and in many ways is actually difficult in execution. But I want to simplify what we're looking at here. I want to focus on differences, all right? C and D we can pair, right? Because we have were and were. And A and B we can pair because we have or not, so because they have was and was, right? So those are some pairings that we can do. Additionally, we can pair D and B and A and C, right? So let's get rid of one of these pairs. All right. The first one I'm going to point to is were. Okay. Were shows, were is incorrect because we see it elsewhere, right? Ethics was the natural outcome of human nature. Seeing it right there clarifies ethics, though it ends in an S, is a singular subject here. And it's like in British, when they talk about math, they don't call it math, they call it maths, right? Um, ethics, though it ends in an S, and it sounds plural, is singular, right? The study of ethics, meaning it is singular. So because it is singular, we can get rid of C and D. Now that puts us between A and B. So we know we want was. That's good. So now we're between ethics, right? Or ethics. So let's compare those, right? Ethics is the word we have to make it possessive. We just want to put an apostrophe after the S because the S is already there. It's a natural part of the word. Even though it's singular, we can put an apostrophe after the S if the word ends in an S. It's as simple as that, right? B is possessive, but the word that we're making possessive isn't ethic. He believed ethic importance was essential, right? He believed the importance of ethic was essential to any philosophical tradition. That just isn't something we would ever say. So why would we do ethic apostrophe S, right? We're showing possession by using the apostrophe whatsoever. That it comes before an S or after an S depends on whether the word has an S innately or whether we need to add one because it doesn't have one innately. Plural things that end in an S have them innately, right? So then we would put an apostrophe after the S. But some words end in an S innately without the apostrophe or without being plural. So it just has an apostrophe at the end. The only exception to this rule would be names like Mr. Jones, and we would put S apostrophe S, but I haven't seen that asked on the SAT. So I'm focused on just why is it A? Well, was is how we want to conjugate to be. And ethics apostrophe maintains the fact that ethics is the word we're discussing, not ethic. Therefore, A. This is a little simpler than you might have thought. All right, so question 20 here is another kind of combo question where we have some bits asking about punctuation and some other bits asking about what word we want to use. So starting off here, we have two independent clauses, right? We have this popularity, though, pales in comparison to its popularity in the region of South America that it is endemic to. That is a period after that, right? We should have a period after that. That's something which can stand entirely on its own, okay? So if we want to put a period there, but we're not given the opportunity to put a period, that means we're going to put a semicolon, right? So the first thing we can do is get rid of C and D, right? Because those both have commas. Now, if you chose C, it kind of makes sense, right? Pales in comparison to its popularity in South America, where yerba mate has been consumed for centuries, right? That kind of sounds good in our ears, but that's not what the sentence is saying. That's not what this passage is saying. We're moving too quickly. If you're writing the passage for yourself, rather than letting the SAT write the passage, if you're not reading the whole passage, but just kind of reading the end, these are all things that might lead you to choose C, which kind of makes sense, but it doesn't work rather than a correct answer, which is B. All right. So where is what could work with a comma, but there is what must work with our real case, which is a semicolon. All right. So we know we need a semicolon here because we have two independent clauses. That's why we're going to go between A and B. And then once we're there, where yerba mate has been consumed for centuries and a deep-seated culture has developed, that is something that can't stand on its own. So A is impossible, but B is correct. All right, so 21 is the last of our real grammar type questions on our first module. After that, we transition to more transition type questions and rhetorical synthesis questions. So in this instance, we're just looking what word fits what we're looking for here best. So from this to that is something very common, but do we say this to that? From learning more about what makes up the planet's atmosphere, scientists should be able to, okay, that kind of sounds fine to our ears, but don't just jump to that without looking at the rest. Our correct answer is by. By learning more about what makes up the planet's atmosphere, scientists should be able to blah, blah, blah. All right. So these proper prepositional phrases is something that the SAT has pulled in. All right, just make sure you're reading the whole thing and looking at the logic. And from that, you'll be able to see what the proper prepositions. That's how we arrive to be. All right, question 22 is our first transitions question on the test, the first in module 1. So remember, we want to think about what transition category do we want to put here, right? Not just what word works, but because many of these words will sound fine. Perhaps it is this fantasy, moreover, that keeps our viewers tuning in every week, right? When you plug that in there, it sounds fine, right? But are we looking to say additionally here, which is the kind of category that moreover is in? No. What we are looking to say is um, we're looking to kind of prove it, right? We're looking to actually have something like thus or therefore, right? Then oftentimes is a timing transition, right? First I jump, then I shoot, right? However, then can also be used in select constructions to mean something similar to thus or therefore in a cause and effect. Perhaps it is this fantasy then, or therefore, that keeps viewers turning in each week, right? So, however is a pivot, right? It means that what came before and what comes next differ, which is not what the case we see here. Likewise means that we are kind of just building on something that's next list, right? And it's similar, right? We aren't showing a similarity here with B. And finally, moreover is what we do to kind of list additional information. But here we're looking to give thus, therefore we want to say then. All right, so 23, I think, is a pretty straightforward question. We have a transitions question, right? Remember, we're looking for categories to start off with. Do we have a pivot? No. Do we have a concession? No. Right? Additionally, though, we do have a little bit of a pivot, but we don't have it in this form, right? We really have here a dependent clause going into an independent clause, right? So the idea of this sentence pivots, but we're not doing it with our traditional transitional adverb. Rather, we're doing it by having a dependent clause to start off a sentence that has a subordinating phrase. All right, so C and D both do that with our subordinating phrases because they're although. Remember, we want to add a transitional adverb to an independent clause. We don't want to add it to something that can't stand on its own. So because would be to say in line with what came before, clee, reverse the process, right? That would need to suggest that he was doing it in order to do the exact opposite of what's been done before. But that meaning, right, is not suggested in this passage, right? It isn't that he wanted to subvert traditional things. It's that he just did, right? So there's a meaning suggested by C in 23, which we just cannot logically, conservatively infer from the passage that we can see in D, right? D is something we can logically, safely infer from the passage. Therefore, we must go with it. All right, if you're missing question 24, I'm really thinking that you're not reading the whole passage, right? Because we really need to understand the logic of this whole passage in order to understand what kind of transition we want here, in order to understand how this question works. All right, so what is the logic of this passage? Albinism occurs when cells that normally make melanin fail to produce the pigment at normal levels. This condition is the result of a mutation in multiple genes in which both parents carry a single copy of the mutation in the same gene. So because it is a um, a multiple genes thing, therefore, the parents of an albino offspring could exhibit no outward signs of albinism. However, albino parents can have children with no phenotype. Moreover, um, albino parents can have children with no phenotypic expression of albinism, right? Um, so we're basically saying parents who are not albino can have albino kids, and parents who are albino can have kids with no albinism seen. All right. So we're basically saying that there isn't a direct connection between, because it is a recessive, right, mutation, and it occurs in multiple genes. Just seeing it in a parent or a child doesn't mean that it must be seen in the parent, the other party, right? We always want to think, what category of transition do we want here, right? This is what we would call cause and effect. Okay, we are looking for a cause and effect transition here. And what fulfills that role? Therefore, right? First things first, moreover might be kind of weird because you're saying, I saw moreover again already. Why would it do that? Right? Moreover, I think though is one that students might fall for because it does sort of sound like you're proving it, but that's not what it means. It's more additionally. That's the category. Nonetheless, and however are both pivoting transitions, right? Nonetheless is a concession, and however is a direct rebuttal pivot. Okay. That would mean the information which came before would need to be pivoted from to a new information right here. Does that happen? No. Is it plausible that this could happen in a different construction and you select that answer choice just because you're on autopilot? Sure, right? But once you really read the whole passage, it's clear that it is that. These transitions questions, if you find that you're missing some of these, you're probably just not reading the passage at a deeper logical enough level. Once you do that, you'll see, though, what transition must be used. All right, so question 25 here is the first of our rhetorical synthesis questions on the test, okay? This question type, if you're missing it consistently, I would suggest you might want to change your approach a little bit and look at our question before we really dig too deeply into our notes, all right? There's really no other question type that I want us doing this sort of strategy on, but for rhetorical synthesis, it seems like a pretty sensible strategy. So what do we need here? What are we looking for? We need the design, so what they look like, and we need the functionality, so how they work, right? So the design of the Brogue shoes began with functionality in mind, meaning we want to show that the way they look is because they wanted to do a certain thing. So what do we learn about Brogues? Well, they're basically wingtips. They have a perforated little holes in them, right? Perforations. But originally, they were to drain water from the shoes in wet conditions, right? Any answer choice which says those things will be basically meeting our parameters, right? It's saying they look the way they do because they wanted to do something in the past. So how do they look? Decorative perforation, right? What was their function? To drain water from the shoes. We need those things in the answer choice. If we don't have those, they don't work, right? So here we have an answer choice with details, right? But what are we missing? We do not have any reason of why those details exist, no functionality. Just saying that they're historically used doesn't mean why. All right, B, we are missing how they were designed, what they looked like, right? Completely. C, we see both our parameters, right? We see the design and we see why the functionality, right? Finally, D, we get maybe something that you could associate with the functionality, right? They were, working shoes. But do we learn what they are? No, not really. And additionally, this, I would say, is not actually their functionality. It's just who wore them. We're inferring too much with D. C says it directly. D says it implicitly. The direct is always better on the SAT. Therefore, C. All right, if you missed 26, you fell for the most common tricky thing that the SAT does on these rhetorical synthesis questions. If you struggle with rhetorical synthesis questions in general, I'd suggest you watch any of the other videos for rhetorical synthesis, which detail how we want to look at the question first before we really look at the notes, find all those things, all right? So we need to have the transit method, and we need an explanation of exoplanets, right? Perfect. Very clearly, that's B, you might think to yourself. Sorry, that's not B, right? So let's go through these. Let's slow down, right? A, we have the transit method, and we have an explanation of exoplanets. Good. That's everything we want. Should be clearly A, you might think. B, we have a description of the transit method, but do we get a description of exoplanets? No. C, we get a description of the transit method and a definition of exoplanets. Okay, wait. Both A and C are good, right? And then D kind of summarizes the thing. So if you're wondering, well, A and C both work. No, they don't, right? There's actually a difference here. Is this definition of the transit method or of something else? Blocks out the light of a parent star to capture an image of an exoplanet? That is not a definition of the transit method. That is a definition of the direct imaging, all right, method. Therefore, A is not actually using, like it asks, relevant, correct information from the notes. All right, so A is not a check. A is wrong because the transit method is not what it was described to be as. However, here, the transit method, observing the slight dimming of a star's light when a planet passes in front, right, is right here, correct. Okay, that's all good. And our definition of an exoplanet, perfect, right? So if you selected A, I'm assuming that's the only answer choice you read. No, 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 right? Always be deductive, process of elimination. Look for something wrong. Look at all of our answer choices if you have time, right? The reason why questions like this show up at the end of a module, you're probably a little bit low on time. Keep your strategy sound, right? Keep your approach sound. This is a common thing that we see on the SAT, this type of error. Selected A, you were thinking correctly, but you executed not. All right, so question 27 here on module 1 is our final rhetorical synthesis question on the first module, and it's our final question on the module at all. With these kind of questions, I suggest you watch other videos of rhetorical synthesis if you're missing these at all consistently, more than one ever. If you're missing any of these ever, watch other videos. Here, we are always wanting to look at the question, making sure, what am I actually looking for? So we want to describe the structure, meaning what is its architecture? What does it look like? and the historical significance, meaning how do historians or other people, why do they care about Göbekli Tepe, right? Why does it matter even though it's a 12,000-year-old thing? All right. So what is its structure, right? We have carved reliefs depicting various animals, right? It's massive stone pillars and circular patterns. Some combination of this, right? Particularly massive stone pillars and circular patterns is what we're looking for, right? That's the structure of the thing. Now, what is its historical significance, right? Anthropologists, it is one of the only mass scale sites before agriculture, right? So we need 1 and 2. We need to say that it's massive stone pillars, maybe something about reliefs on the stone pillars. And we need to say it's the first massive site before agriculture. All right. Let's see what answer choices do here. All right. A has all of the significance, but does A have the structure? No. So we have no structure for A, and therefore we can get rid of it, right? It's missing one of our parameters. For B, we have all the structure, right? This is what it looks like. Good. But what's missing for B? No, his significance, right? All right, C. Again, we have, right, historical significance. But does it actually say what it looks like? No, it just says it was built. D has both, right? D, this is what it looks like. Good. This is why it matters. Good. It has both of our parameters, meaning it has everything we need. The others don't have both parameters, so they're not sufficient. Therefore, D. And that brings us to the end of Module 1's reading and writing. All right, so we're working through the first question of our second module here on test 300. We have a word and context question, looking at basically vocab, right? So if you're missing this question, I think you're probably choosing the answer choice endurance, because in many ways, endurance kind of fits the tenor or the content of this passage in a overall, but doesn't actually fit the claim made in this final sentence. All right. So I would assume you're choosing this because you don't really know what maybe the correct answer choice means. Right. So first, let's get rid of some other ones. To trammel means to kind of like tromp around, to move around, to walk over something, right? Like elephants might trammel through the woods. Momentous means when something is kind of like important, it has momentum, it has a big impact. His thing was definitely momentous, but he wouldn't call it a momentous, right? It's kind of in the wrong use. So we're between endurance and endeavor. And if you don't know what endeavor means, it's a really good classic word, right? An endeavor is kind of like a quest, right? A thing that you set out to do. His endeavor, what he did, what he accomplished, and what he set out to do is perfect, right? That details exactly what we're looking to make with this claim, meaning that what he had done led to a tradition of hiking the whole Appalachian Trail from front to end. Endurance, he needed endurance to do this, but it wasn't his endurance that engendered this tradition. It was that he accomplished the thing itself, all right? So if you don't know what endeavor means, it's a word that's kind of outside of your vocabulary. That's the reason why you're not going to select this. However, it is our best word. Study your vocab if you're missing one like this, assuming you're choosing endurance because you just feel more comfortable with the word and the fact that it's related to this topic whatsoever. All right, question 2 of our second module here is another word and context question. We have a kind of not, it has some difficult vocabulary words in here, but I would say it's not the most difficult. However, they all are a little bit weird and they all are looking relatively similar, but they have different meanings, all right? If these are all words that you don't know what they mean, it is likely that you need to basically study, all right? It it is important to have all this vocabulary for the test, and if you don't have all this vocabulary for the test, you're going to kind of struggle. Right, so what some of these things mean: to extrapolate, or an extrapolation, is to go on about something, right? To give more details, to elaborate on something, right? It also means to kind of connect, right? So an extrapolation would be to, can you extrapolate upon that, meaning to give more information, or that something is a weak extrapolation, meaning it's a weak connection. Exploitation means to, it sometimes means to take advantage of something. Other times it means to use something, right? So we might, a boss might exploit their workers, right? Or you might just kind of like exploit your resources at home, meaning like I'm gonna, exploit what I've got in the pantry right now, meaning use it in a positive sense. It can sometimes have a negative connotation. An amalgamation means a connection or a putting all together, right? You amalgamate different things into one thing. So you take a bunch of disparate, unlikely to be connected elements or things like that, and you put it all together. And then finally, approbation is when something you're giving something, or it gets praise, right? So you might say like, while almost all of the movies by all of Martin Scorsese's movies have been met with, general approbation, some of his later works have been a little bit more middling in how they've been received, right? Meaning everybody loves all his early stuff, all the critics give him high praise, but later it's changed. So of all of those, that what works the best? Amalgamation, right? Because amalgamation fits the context here of saying that we are putting together all of these different things. We have congregating, right? Coming together, right? We see blend, which means putting together, right? All of these things are synonymous with amalgamation. Even if you don't know what amalgamation is, you can hopefully get rid of some of these other ones to arrive at the correct answer. However, if that's not what's happening, you might be needing to study more vocabulary to get rid of more of these. I don't think extrapolation, exploitation, or approbation really make any sense in the context here. But if you don't know what at least one of those is, you're going to be stuck on a 50-50 guess. And a 50-50 guess is not where we want to be on the SAT, right? We want to be confident or certain. We know why our answer choice is correct. And we know why all the other answer choices are incorrect. We can get there, then we're rolling. If not, not the best. A question here on module 2 is another word and context question, and another question which I would say we're going to have a lot easier of a time with if we know a bunch of vocab words, but if we don't, we're going to struggle. All right. The correct answer, I'm just going to give some definitions. The correct answer here, provenance, or provenance, means basically the established paperwork that verifies art. Okay, it's a very specific word. It's a word that the SAT loves to exploit, meaning the SAT loves technical language. They love jargon, things that only mean one thing, but it's kind of niche, right? Provenance or provenance, right, is a perfect example of that, right? It has to do with art and how we clarify who owns art. Accordance means basically like a agreement. Manifestation doesn't just mean like, oh, like I believe I'm going to be a superstar and I say I'm a superstar, so I turn into a superstar, right? It's not just that kind of like TikTok new age mumbo jumbo. It also basically means like a real life iteration of something, right? So, or something coming into being. So like perhaps that belief is a manifestation of the lack of belief in science nowadays, right? And then an indication is something like it demonstrates something. So if we're choosing the wrong answer choice here, I'm assuming we're just uncomfortable with the idea that provenance, right, is a word that you don't know what it means. So how on earth can I use it as the correct answer? But when you plug indication, manifestation, or accordance into this paragraph about basically like finding the, you know, true ownership of art, none of those fit. None of those other three fit. So we can be confident with answer choice C, even if we don't know what it means, because all these other ones don't make sense. However, if you don't know what any of these other words mean, you're going to have a hard time coming to the correct answer, right? You're not going to be able to follow that process of elimination. So studying vocab is going to help you not only know what the correct answer is, it's going to help you know what the incorrect answers mean, which can help you arrive at the correct answer, right? I think that that's probably the best, most likely way students have gotten this question correct. I doubt very many of them know what that word for answer choice C means, but if you got this incorrect, it's likely that you were just kind of uncomfortable with the word you didn't know, or there were other words in this answer choice that you didn't know what it meant. Study vocab. My question 4 here on module 2 of test 300. The correct answer is a really classic example of something the SAT loves to do in the word and context or the vocabulary section. All right. It is a word which its most common definition is one we probably all know. A harbor is like a port, right? It's a safe place for boats to go. We probably, most of us know harbor in that meaning. However, that isn't the only use of harbor. And this is what aligns with typical College Board SATs. They love to use words where we know the main definition, but secondary and tertiary definitions are less commonly, used by people of our generation. All right. Harbor can also mean to hold on to something, right? So those born during the famine retain is what harbor would mean, right? Sometimes it's used in like older literature to mean like, oh, I still harbor some feelings for you, right? Meaning like, though I'm not supposed to feel for you anymore because I'm a butler and you're a, lady of rank, right? In some 1800s British society, I still hold on to some affection or still hold on to some feelings for you. It's also been used talking about like kind of villains or good things, right? So it's like, you know, the even though, right, like um a city maybe that was conquered back in the day, like everyone was on board with the new rulers, maybe like some areas they harbor some resentment or keep some resentment against their new owners. So harbor is working in that way here, which is perfect because the context of this says that a bunch of people who were born during the Dutch famine continue or retain to have some of the genetic information or genetic material that keeps them holding on to calories, right? They were overweight and all these things because they're born in the famine, and epigenetic differences mean they're like more likely to hold on to food because they're, they were born in a time of hunger. So harbor here means to retain or to keep or to have ongoing. Um, but if you're like thinking harbor means a port, harbor means a body of water, and you see that, you're like, oh, no way harbor works here, and you just check it off. That's why we need to have secondary and tertiary definitions of things. That's why we at Hamilton Education have a vocab list with secondary and tertiary definitions. To repudiate something is to go against something, right? And that would be an opposite distractor here. We're looking not for that. To admit means either to like, I'm going to admit the truth here, right? You give it up, or it means to let something in, right? New admits, right? People that we are letting in. I can understand if you chose that because like, oh, it's letting in some genetic information which codes for these things. But doesn't harbor, now that we know what harbor means, work better than emit? Absolutely. Value, same thing. It kind of sort of fits if you squint, but it's not really how we would use it all the time. It's not really how that word works. But harbor works now that we know what harbor means. Perfect. So that's why we can arrive to A. But if you're not arriving there, study some vocab. All right, question 5 is a really great word in context or vocab question here. All right. We have some good kind of good use vocab words for that from the SAT, right? We have some words which are used, but maybe not all the time. But once you learn of them, you're like, oh, that's a word I could use. All right. Arcane means hard to understand, right? Arcane used to be used to talk about like what wizards were up to, right? Something is arcane, meaning you can't really make sense of it. It's like looking at runes, right? Sometimes you might think your physics textbook is arcane, or this novel that your teacher is having you read is arcane, or the SAT is arcane, meaning it's you can't make sense of it. Anachronistic means it's out of its time or era, right? So it doesn't fit anymore. Very famously, Game of Thrones, which is like a show that was very popular on HBO. Their final seasons kind of like were bad. They kind of sucked compared to what had come before. And there was some big anachronistic errors, right? There was like a Starbucks cup that was in one of the shots, right? You would never see Starbucks doesn't exist in Westeros where the show is set. But sometimes there'll be anachronistic things on purpose, right? So like there's a movie about Marie Antoinette, the famous queen of France during the time of the French Revolution. The movie Marie Antoinette, the soundtrack is all these like bangers from the 80s, right? All this like kind of post-punk good stuff. There's a scene of her birthday and it's playing the song Ceremony by New Order. And it's like, whoa, I mean, this is taking place in like the 1780s or 1760s, 1770s. And we're hearing a song from the 1980s, but it fits, right? But it just doesn't, or it works, but it still is like something from outside of its time, right? They weren't listening to that in the 1700s. Discarded means thrown away, right? And then fashionable means of fashion, right? I think if you got this answer choice wrong, you're likely choosing discarded or fashionable, right? Because both of those kind of fit the content of the overall thing, and they kind of are words that we know what they mean, right? They're more common words than anachronistic for sure. But anachronistic is the perfect word for this situation. While mediums may seem discarded in the 2020s, doesn't quite work seeing that we're saying they're all there, right? This passage is about how older things from the 1980s, which you wouldn't expect to see in the 2020s now that we have, I hate to say it, but Spotify, evil. Hopefully none of your parents work there. Um, you know, why would we see cassettes and vinyl records or iPods nowadays when we have something so much better, right? It's out of place. It's anachronistic to have those things, right? Those mediums aren't discarded. They're very popular. And while they may seem fashionable, they have seen a surprising resurgence, right? Fashionable might sound good there, but it doesn't match the logic now that we see right here surprising, right? So now that we know what anachronistic means, it's very clearly the correct answer. If you're missing something like this, guess what? Study some vocab and you'll be more likely to succeed. Right, so question 6 here is our final word and context question on module 2, meaning it's our final word and context question on the test as a whole. Right, kind of an interesting passage here, basically saying babies or children, they make and hold memories from when they were literally born, but they eventually discard these memories, as we see right here described, right? Some of us keep random ones around them. So if you ask a 2 or 3-year-old what they remember, they might remember things from when they were 1 year old. But they won't remember those things once they turn 4 years old. They get rid of them. They just discard them. All right. So Let's talk about what some of these words mean. All right, retained means to keep along. All right, this is a classic distractor type or wrong answer type that we see on the tests, which is basically an opposite distractor. We see that they're holding and forming memories. If you're rushing through this, you might think, okay, so they retain those memories, right? They're kept, they're held, they're formed. But we're saying the opposite here. We're saying that we get rid of them. Manipulated. We often talk about, that's kind of what we would call maybe a baggage distractor here. We often talk about how memories are manipulated, right? Inception was this really popular movie talking about like manipulated memories and dreams. However, it doesn't really fit here. We're not talking about like changing a memory or remembering something wrong. Finally, disseminated means to pass something out, right? Or to spread something around. Doesn't really make sense here. So hopefully, if you know all of those other words, you can arrive at this word that's kind of tricky, kind of unique, jettisoned, even if you don't know what it means, right? You know, retained, manipulated, and disseminated. You stick close to the text, you read the whole thing, you see, the logic of those don't really fit here. I'm gonna have to go to this one that I don't know what it means, but I know that the other three don't work. That's the process here. You're going to get this correct, even if you don't know what jettison means. But if you know what jettison means, you're going to get it a lot easier, right? You don't have to really think. What does jettison mean? Get rid of, right? Discarded. Comes from boats, right? So we jettison what we would call ballast on a boat, which were like rocks that help keep a boat stable in the ocean. You're basically just getting rid of excess things. You're throwing it overboard, right? Jettisoned, meaning discarded. So with that, that brings us to the end of our vocab one context here on this test, PSAT 300. All right, so question 7 is a function question, right? It's asking, how does this underlined piece function in the overall structure of a text? As I've said in other videos here, we need to consider the whole. We cannot look at only the part and say this is what the part does without looking at the whole as well. So what we have here is what we would call a pivot, right? We start with a classic pivot word, however, and then we show what the pivot is. Claims of evidence of the continued existence of the thylacine continue this day, right? So here it says thylacine are extinct, and then here it says, well, these claims are likely dubious, but meaning likely not true, right? But we still are going to make an effort to find these claims, right? So there is some hope despite the lack of likelihood that the thylacine still exists. It's also called the Tasmanian wolf. All right, so what does this thing do? It pivots from the fact that they are extinct to an idea that maybe they are not extinct, even if it is very, very, very unlikely. All right, so shifts the focus is good, but B is not the only answer choice which shifts the focus. If you miss this question, I'm assuming you liked, oh, it shifts the focus without reading the rest, right? Is this an exhaustive evaluation of the merits of claims that they still exist? No, right? It is not exhaustive, right? We don't look at any claims that they still exist, right? We just talk about it in the general, right? So also, is this a scientific description of the thylacine? No, we don't talk about their jaws, the way they were, much about them other than that they existed. Okay. C, however, it shifts the focus. Perfect. A general overview of the thylacine. Perfect. What they looked like, kind of where they lived, a little bit general, to a general discussion of whether they might still be existent, right? That is perfect. Okay. If you chose B here, you just got to be a little bit more rigorous and keep going and not take too little of time. If you selected A or D, that's not a very good sign to me. All right. It looks like you're going to need to make sure that you're spending time on this question with your tutor or your teacher. All right, so question 8 is a cross-text analysis question, meaning we are going to put these two texts together and see what they say. When we are asked, how would someone respond to a claim in text 1? They already do. Okay, we don't need to invent who this writer is or invent what kind of claims they might take. It's already basically stated. So we need to look at the claim by Smith in text 1. So what is the Smith claim? That there's a certain propensity, a certain likelihood, something that we're natively, naturally doing to barter, truck, and exchange one thing for another. Basically, changing things, being kind of like a market being is natural to who we are as people. So how would Polanyi respond to that? Well, according to Polanyi, that doesn't make any sense, right? It's a unscientific argument that looks to legitimize how we behave nowadays rather than looking at evidence. It doesn't have to do with evidence, which is very typical of economics. Most kind of like classical neoliberal capitalist economics is not really based on evidence. It's more based on kind of like theorizing, right? So here we go to evidence and we see that these are the three things that were common: reciprocity, redistribution, and a householding, right? So this is what we actually did prior, to market systems. We don't necessarily have a natural propensity to exchange things. So which would show that there's disagreement? Well, because that's what we want. Well, C and D, right? Deference means you're saying, you're really smart, I'm just gonna let you say it. No qualms, meaning complete agreement, no problems. So we've got disagreement or contention, right? Contention means that you disagree. However, why is there disagreement? Well, it's not because he dislikes that Adam Smith is outside the conventional school. In fact, it says that they are the conventional, okay? So C doesn't make any sense as a result of that. D, what is the proof? Why is D correct? Well, it says he would disagree because these things are pre-market organization, while this is supposed to just, again, legitimize modern conventions. So D is the only answer choice, which says that he disagreed for the correct reasons why he disagreed, as opposed to C, which says he disagreed, but gives the wrong explanation. If you're choosing C, you're not spending enough time here. If you're choosing A or B, you're likely having a problem with, honestly, vocabulary, as is much of the case of this test. All right, if you're missing number 9, you got to look at some of my other questions talking about the function of underlined sentences within the text as a whole, okay? Question 7 is a good example of that. In module 1, there's some good examples, okay? Remember, if you are looking at just a part without looking at the whole, you're not going to understand the function. You can't understand what a car engine's real intention is unless you look at the car as a whole. So what is all of this saying? Well, it's ultimately saying that even if something looks good, right, it has good appearances, right? There's certain parts are well formed. It is false, right? There are ultimately, it is ultimately fallacious, meaning false, right? It should not be justified. Then we get a little metaphor that kind of clarifies what's going on. The gilded pill. So what's with something that's gilded? It means it's coated in something pretty, right? We have a gilded artwork, right? It's like a sugar-coated pill. Is often found to contain the most deadly poison. So I don't know how often we're taking gold-covered pills that happen to have poison in them. It might not be the most common thing as a metaphor or an analogy, but it is definitely a metaphor and an analogy, right? So the thing that we're not going to be able to get help with here is metaphor, analogy, those all work, right? So here, though, this is incorrect, right? It says it's well-formed, but only in the unimportant things. Does it have consideration and great care? Well, it says there's consideration and great care that you need to put onto it, but it is well-formed, but not in the right way, okay? So D is what we would call recycled language. They're using recycled language directly from the text, but it isn't relevant, all right? C, it is flawed, good, right? But is it that its functionality is unimportant? There's too many unimportant provisions that kind of stand in the way of its functionality? No. All right. B is correct. Why? Because it's ideal only superficially, right? Just the surface level. It's gilded, gold just on the outside of it. When on a deeper level, inside the pill, it is deleterious or bad, right? Meaning there's poison inside the pill. That's why we can roll with B. And A, again, medicine, a pill, right? Like, oh, that kind of sounds interesting, right? But this is saying that the government is bad, and the new government, it's just not going to work, right? Because it has certain problems that you see underneath the real thing. So B is our answer choice. All right, 10 is a main idea question. This is honestly probably the most particular question on the test. I would say if you're missing this and you are selecting A as the incorrect answer choice, I don't think it is fair, but I don't think that the SAT is going to be quite as nitpicky as this is here, right? So he grew up in the belief that his father, right? So Dmitry grew up with the belief that he had property and he would be independent on coming of age, right? So he would become 18 years old, however old it was in Russia at the time, and he would get property from his dad. He would be independent. He could just hold on his own. Therefore, he acted crazy, right? He made all these bad decisions, right? He went into debt. He spent a bunch of money, right? He was a big gambler, and he made all these sort of financial mistakes. Okay, so because he would assume he would inherit property, he made bad financial decisions. Okay, bad decisions in general, but bad financial decisions. All right. A says something very similar, right? He made rash decisions, which is good, right? Derived from a mistaken belief about his father. Yes. But are they talking about his father's social status? Not explicitly. Now, I will admit, many of us maybe know that social status is tied to property in these olden days, okay? If you are aware of that and you're saying, oh, that's why this is, it's A and B are indistinguishable, well, you're making a bit of a baggage distractor. I will point that out. That's why I think it is fair to say that B is better than A, but I think on the actual SAT, it might say something a little bit different, maybe less father's social status and maybe something more along the lines of like, his father's position in government or something that actually isn't explicitly referred to or even implicitly referred to in the text. All right. If you chose C or D, right, you're kind of misreading this in general. You might want to work with your tutor or your teacher to kind of get deeper and better at reading older texts. All right. So as such, B is correct because there's nothing wrong with it. A is less correct than B because it's a little bit too much of implication rather than explicit information from the text. All right, so question 11, we get a selection from, the classic guy, Marcel Proust. It's a classic example you might have read in class before, although it's more likely to be read in a kind of undergrad seminar, introductory or mid-level intermediate literary class than it is in high school. But it's like the story of the Madeleine, right? Which is that it is an unexpected moment of remembrance. I know you've all read this because you're watching this video, you took this test, and you likely got this question wrong if you're watching this video. So I'm not going to reread the whole passage for you, right? What we need to see is what causes the narrator to resuscitate the memory, all right? So where in the text do we see that the memory is resuscitated, all right? So what is the memory? Well, it wasn't the sight, right? So that's not the sight, but it was all of a sudden the taste, okay? So we need to make sure that the taste is what is invoking this memory, right, of being in Cambrai and all this stuff. All right, many of these answer choices have what we would call true but irrelevant or recycled language distractors, right? Do they talk about the sight of the little Madeleine and pastry cook's windows? Yes, right? It's right at the beginning. But is it the sight that returns the memory? Well, it literally says the sight is not relevant. Does he go to Cambrai and stay indoors? Is that something that was relevant? Well, it doesn't say that he's necessarily doing that here, right? But that is something that's referenced in the text, but it isn't related to how the memory is triggered. Finally, is his memory triggered by thinking about his memory? No, it is triggered, as it says. It isn't that, right? It is that he smelled it and tasted it, and it all comes roaring back to him. Therefore, our answer is D. Watch out for those recycled language distractors on these literary texts, and make sure you're really digging into the text and staying focused through a little bit longer, a little bit more difficult, older form of the written English form. All right, 12 is a command of evidence quantitative question. So ultimately, we want to make sure that what we're choosing as our answer choice not only aligns with the text, right, but also aligns with what we see in our graph. So first things first, what is the student's conclusion? When predator populations increase, prey populations decrease to, importantly, so low a quantity that they are unable to recover. All right, so just that it might be true that when predator populations increase, right? So predator being the dots, when they go up, oftentimes as they go up, as we see right here, right? Prey populations go down, as we see right here, okay? That's true. But the student's claim is that once they go down, they can't ever recover, which we see right here. The moose go back up even when the wolves are really high, right? So the prey are always able to rebound. What aligns with that? Well, even if we have high populations of wolves right here in this kind of time frame, right? The moose, and I kind of cluttered this up here, but you'll have your own. The moose are able to rebound despite that high prey abundance or that high predator abundance, right? So we have high levels here subsequent. So does that mean they were unable to recover? No, it means they did recover, right? That weakens the student's argument. So A confuses predator and prey, right? And right, it says that the predators recovered, which isn't correct. Okay, we switched the relationship. We should know that. C suggests that is kind of a baggage distractor, right? If you know anything about ecology, you know that we need predators to create a landscape of fear and all these other things. But that's not related to the student's claim. So this one is also illogical as well, right? Even though we do have a high level in 1980 or so, it does maybe crash, but that doesn't have to do with food shortages among prey, right? The prey is the moose. So only answer choice that works based on the graph is B. Okay, question 13 is doing a really tricky little thing for us here, all right? This is a classic question that a classic trap that the SAT sets for us in that we are not actually looking at what is claimed by the main person in here. We are looking at what is popularly claimed. So the claim by the main person is Mary Cohen, right? Which is that influence is not actually teens, right? So Mary Cohen's claim is that ultimately it is, so this is Mary Cohen's claim here, right? How much it changes has to do with personality and social standing as with age, and that teenagers are grossly overstated, right? But what we are looking for isn't Mary Cohen's claim. We are looking for what is popularly claimed. So what is popularly claimed? That teenagers change language a lot. So if you chose, for example, answer choice B, right? Answer choice C, you're doing a really good job of understanding Mary Cohen's claim and using that to support or weaken her argument. But that's not what we're looking at here. We're looking at the popular claim. What's the popular claim? Teens drive this stuff. What shows that? D, right? Shows that teenagers are more likely than any other group to use newer slang. Okay, that's the popular claim. All right, so if you didn't recognize that this is what we're looking for, you're going to have trouble here. Slow down a little bit might help you out. And also just being aware that the SAT likes to, mess with us in this way will help you be aware of this going forward. Right, 14 is very similar to question 13 in that we are not looking for an overall understanding of this. We're looking for something specific. So we are wanting to show an example of the basic problem. So what is the basic problem? According to the text, they use the direct word, basic problem, right? Genetic modification has not accelerated crop yields or reduced chemical pesticides, right? So GMOs don't mean there's more use of, GMOs don't mean there's less pesticides. GMOs do not mean there is more yield, all right? What shows that? C. A study shows that GMOs did not increase yield compared to a control group. Perfect, all right? You might be getting into baggage distractors. We all know a little bit about GMOs if you're missing this one, right? You might be pro-GMO. Maybe you have parents who are involved in this for some godforsaken reason, right? So you might be selecting B out of kind of like a baggage distractor. You might be selecting D because it doesn't exemplify the basic problem, but exemplifies the promise of GMOs, okay? But C is the only one that identifies or exemplifies the basic problem, which is that increased use of GMO does not increase crop yields, right? It says it directly. A is a clear baggage distractor. If you're just kind of anti-GMOs, you're like, oh, they're carcinogenic, right? They cause cancer, right? That doesn't have to do with increased yield. That's not the real basic problem according to the text. All right, question 15 is definitely one of the most tricky questions on this test. All right. So we have a lot of weird language that we don't maybe know. If you have a problem with vocabulary, this is going to be hard, right? Eschewed technical acumen in favor of artistic naivety. What does that mean? He ignored being really technical at art, or Dadaists ignored being really technical at art and preferred something kind of naive, like childlike, right? It seemed to lead, but it was a harbinger, right? It means bringing about the conceptual art movement, okay? However, Duchamp, though he's associated, okay, this is a pivot, though, we see it right here, though he is associated with Dada, he defies the disparaging typecast, right? Meaning he goes against the stereotype of Dadas as technically deficient, right? So we need to logically complete this text by showing how he defies or goes against the stereotype of Dadaists as being technically bad at things. We need to show that he is complicated and technical. We need to show the opposite of the stereotype because he is not just your typical Dadaist. What shows that? Well, he has exceedingly intricate and technically difficult studies of light, kinetics, and other scientific topics informed by an interest in math and engineering. That's surely technical. That's surely complicated, right? That's surely not artistic naivety, right? This is something technical. He's defying the typecast. He's going against the stereotype. All these other answer choices usually kind of align with the stereotype, right? A aligns with the stereotype, okay, of childlike artistic naivete. All right. C focuses on something else, right? But then it still shows a disdain for technical proficiency, right? So that is the part that's wrong. And then D, it's talking about simple avocations of purity of math and other sort of things, critiques of conformity and elitism. This might all be true. This is interesting, but it's ultimately irrelevant to the whether he is defying or going against the stereotype of Dadaist as technically deficient or bad technically by showing that he's really technically skilled as an artist. Therefore, B is the only one which says that, so we go with B. All right, question 16 here is the final reading question on Module 2, the final reading question for all of this Test 300. We have another logical completion, or what we would call inference question, just like question 15. It's also very tricky. Okay, we have a bunch of technical language thrown at us, something the SAT loves to do. We see ectothermic, right? What is an ectothermic thing? It's the opposite of an endothermic thing. Okay, so we get a double definition here, right? So mammals or endothermic animals maintain, I'm going to highlight this with different colors, right? So endothermic, we'll do pink, okay? Endothermic maintain a stable internal temperature by utilizing heat from internal body function, all right? So internal body function, endothermic, stable heat. Ectothermic means they are reliant on ambient temperature to determine their body temperature. All right. So there's some fish which are able to not be ectothermic, right? So there's some endothermic types of fish, such as tunas and mackerel sharks, which use internal functioning to regulate internal body temperature. So like a great white. All right. However, there are true ectothermic fish which have found behavioral, meaning ways they act, that emulate the stability of endotherms. Okay. Now, that does not mean they are endotherms. What does an endotherm do? It utilizes internal body function to maintain a heat stability in the internal temperature, right? The way your body acts keeps your temperature stable. True ectothermic fish have a behavioral, a way they act to maintain stability, okay? What does an ectothermic thing mean? It means ambient temperature, temperature around them, the temperature they're living in determines what their body temperature is, okay? So any physiological action here cannot work. If you miss this question because you chose something like D, right? Shivering and perspiration, which induce changes in body temperature. That is not ambient, right? That is not ectothermic. Doing that is internal processes to increase your body temperature. That is not ectothermic. Okay, that's not something you need to know from biology. That's just the logic of what we read right here. C, Same thing, right? This is physiological, right? That is not a behavioral thing. What does behavior mean? It means an action. So what action can you do that shows that would be this, right? They maintain a core body temperature by staying in ambient environments, right? Places with a temperature that are very stable. So they keep a very stable internal temperature by just staying in one general temperature. All right. B is an opposite distractor because it's the opposite of stability, right? This is very different. Okay. So A is the only answer choice which says the way they behave without any physiological things, being true ectotherms, allows them to maintain a core stable temperature because they just have a stable ambient temperature. And with that, we end the reading section of this test, and we'll move on to the grammar section. All right, so question 17 here is our first grammar question on module 2 of test 300. We're being asked about possession and number here. All right, so we have a couple of different things at play. So the first thing I want to mention is we can kind of narrow our focus here, right? We have A and D with media apostrophe S and B and C with medias apostrophe after. All right, so media is even though the media is made up of many different companies, many different people, right? We don't, media, if it's plural or singular, is the same, right? You're never going to say the medias talking about all of the different media companies, right? The media as a whole is just media. You would never just put an S after it to make it plural, right? So both B and C are impossible on those grounds, right? You would never, whether it's plural or singular, I don't think you really ever really use a plural in that sense, but you would never put an S after media and then an apostrophe after that S because it's never would be medias. The only time we would maybe see that is if you're talking about art, I guess, but even there, it's kind of weird. Now we're between, so that puts us between A and D. What's the real difference between A and D, right? Talking about is biases possessive or not, right? So we know biases is plural, right? So we're going to, if it is possessive or not, we're going to put, or if it's possessive, we're going to put the apostrophe after the S because the S makes it plural, right? So we can have two possessive things in a row. We have it here, the media's biases, right? Meaning the biases of the media and the consequences of these biases, right? Remember, we can put it in that of form, the blank of blank, the consequences of these biases. If we can put it in that form, it means it's possessive, right? As such, we have to resolve to D. Okay, so bias needs to be possessive and plural. Media needs to be possessive. Therefore, we go with D because that meets both parameters. All right, we have kind of a almost like a word choice question here, even though it's ultimately about grammar. How do these function here, which is our best fit, right? Seemingly means in a way, right? But it doesn't mean truly. Ultimately means at the end. Therefore is cause and effect. Albeit means how kind of like it's almost like a concession, right? It's like saying though. Okay, that's what we want here, right? If you didn't know what albeit is, you could probably arrive to that by getting rid of these other answer choices that don't make any sense, which is basically saying that, cartographers are they're pretty successful, even if they are not always doing it in the most straightforward way. So that's that. All right, so question 19 here is another grammar question. This is a punctuation question. I'm sure many students struggled with this question. If you're here watching this video because you missed 19, I assure you, you are not the only one. However, I want to point out that this is a little bit of an easier question than you might have expected. All right. So one of the first things I want to point out, this is the ultimate kicker, is we have a non-essential phrase beginning with such as, all right, right here, such as, that needs to be completed, such as the Gaelic Athletic Association. B is the only correct answer because all of the rest of these are missing a comma in order to finish our non-essential phrase that we begin with such as. All right? Something as simple as that. This question, which is super complicated, super confusing on the other hands, right? Like, should I be using a semicolon here, just a comma, right? Should I be making including Gaelic football an entire non-essential phrase or not, right? All these sort of things that stand in the way and really make us contemplate it, right? Do I need to end with a semicolon here or not? All of those things are ultimately irrelevant to getting this particular question correct. All right. If you're curious about other elements of this question, this is something to ask your tutor, right? Talk to your tutor about, okay, what is, why do I want to use a semicolon here as opposed to a comma? Why do I want to end this with a comma after football rather than a semicolon, rather than no comma whatsoever, right? All this other information is something to really discuss with your tutor more in depth. What makes this and breaks this question is just the simple, does the non-essential phrase beginning with such as get finished? It only gets finished with B. Therefore, that is our only correct answer, right? Sometimes you really have to narrow your focus and focus on what's different between all these things. And once you do that, you can arrive to the correct answer even on a bewildering, overwhelming question like 19. All right, question 20 is a question that surprisingly I find a lot of students struggle with, even though in my opinion, I think it's a little bit straightforward. Why might we struggle with this? Well, I think we might not be reading the whole passage, right? This takes place in 768 Common Era. All right, this takes place 1300 years ago. But we're not going to be saying stretch. All right, a lot of people want to choose stretch. Yeah, modern France maybe stretches from here to there, but this is in the past tense, simply put, right? Stretched is in our past tense. All right. So at their fullest extent, they stretched. They did stretch, right? If they had stretched from one place to another, that means at the beginning they were a certain length, but then they shrunk during Charlemagne's rule, right? Had stretched means that more is coming. In this story, we don't have that. And then they were stretched means, I mean, it doesn't really work here because I feel like it suggests that it's something that we're stretching, right? We're just talking about simple past. So what's our simple past tense? Stretch. All right, if you missed 21, I assure you, you are not the only one. 21 is a really tricky question. It does something that the SAT loves to do, which is use what we call an exception, right? People, 95% of the time we use people in everyday speech. People is plural, right? There is one person walking down the street, and then they were joined by their friend, and now there are two people walking down the street, right? We don't say persons to mean plural form of person. We say people. However, in a rare 5% of the time, people used in a different form is singular. This is usually when we're referring to an ethnic group or some sort of people, right? Like a grouping of people. Okay, so if we were to say the Romans were a vicious, warlike people, right? We're talking about kind of like a broad group, okay? Or you can talk, and then, so that's a singular people, which is rare. And then peoples can be plural for that form of people, right? When people is singular, referring to an ethnic group or like a group or body conglomeration, peoples refers to multiple of those, right? So we could maybe say like the ancient nomadic peoples or ancient civilized peoples or what have you. Ancient Mesoamerican peoples, meaning kind of like civilizations, had very advanced mathematics and astronomy, right? So there's an instance where people, which is typically plural, is singular, and peoples, which is a word we never usually say, is plural, all right? This is that example, right? We have nomadic peoples, displaced peoples, right? We see this earlier in the sentence to kind of clue us in, okay? So peoples is plural, right? We are not saying people apostrophe s the way we normally do when people is plural. Here, people is singular. That means we have to get rid of B and D, right? Neither of those use peoples the way that we have it here, where peoples itself is plural. Now, our next thing to look at is whether our impacts or impact, right? We need to see, is this singular or plural? Well, we see that impact must be singular rather than plural because we see it later. It was singular, only one, singular, of many factors, right? Elsewhere, we see that we have singular. So there are two ways you could be missing this. You might be missing it because you think peoples should be people, right? And people should be plural, which is true 95% of the time, but not in this exception that the SAT loves to exploit. Or you might be struggling with, do I want impacts, plural, or impact, singular? Well, here's where you can tell that it's singular. All right, so for 22, we have a first transition question on the second module. So we're between nonetheless, though, however, and consequently. There's a classic trick that we are taught, which is, well, if two transitions of the same type are in our answer choices, neither of them can be correct. Okay, and we have learned that nonetheless and however, generally speaking, are very similar. They both are pivots, even if nonetheless is a little bit more of a concession. It's a little bit different from however, but they're very, very similar. However, there is a difference between these two all of a sudden. What is the difference? We have a semicolon before nonetheless and a comma before however. So they're different in their construction. They're different in the way they fit. So that means, is everything that comes before our transition an independent clause? Or is our transition coming embedded within an independent clause? So let's see. Getty, nonetheless, often spoke about is Getty on its own a independent clause? No. Remember, anytime we use a semicolon, except for in lists, right, special lists, anytime we're using a semicolon other than in lists, what's on the left and on the right of the semicolon must be able to stand on its own as a sentence. In this case, both Getty cannot stand on its own. It's not a clause whatsoever. Therefore, A and B are both impossible because of that semicolon. So now we're between, okay, are we pivoting or are we showing kind of cause and effect? And in this case, we're pivoting, right? We're saying he is very rich, but he nonetheless had a bunch of troubles, right? However, he had a bunch of troubles, a pivot. He was rich, but he wasn't the best ever, right? So C is the only one that shows that pivot. All the sympathy to J. Paul Getty, the dude who had a lot of money and bought a lot of art. All right, so 23 is another transitions question, just like 22. I'm assuming if you missed 23, you have a little bit of an unclear understanding of what the word henceforth means. Hence, without the fourth, means thus, as so, as such, therefore, right? But henceforth does not mean as such, like D. Henceforth means from this point on, right? Pope Francis, for example, his real name is like Jorge, all right? When he was elected as Pope, though, he decided that henceforth he would be known as Pope Francis II, all right? So henceforth means from this point on. Hence means as such, but henceforth is not hence, right? Why do we want it to be as such and not from this point forward? Because we have a direct linkage between the sentence before and the sentence after. He saw the organ as a gift to people in San Diego and the world. Therefore, he said it must be free. Because gifts, guess what? Are free. Okay? So that's what we have as such. If you're missing this question with A or C, you just don't know what your transitions are, you need to study those desperately. If you are missing 23 by choosing henceforth, now you're making just a little tricky error where you're not realizing henceforth and hence means something different. Study up on that. You'll see as such is our best transition. Remember, a fancy word is not always the best word. Henceforth and nevertheless are a little fancier than something like as such, but as such is the only one that actually works. All right, 24 is the final transitions question on this test as a whole. It's a really easy question. If you miss this one, unfortunately, you're probably just not engaging with the text enough, okay? This isn't a transitional adverb like we typically see. Rather, this is a transition using what we would call a dependent clause, right? So we have a subordinating word that starts this out, right? So although is our subordinating word that we want to use, right? So it's basically saying, even if there is some disagreement, we all agree that when Spaniards came into existence, at least at that point in time, there were 30 different autonomous Kumeyaay clans. Because doesn't work, right? Now, despite is the right idea, but this word there makes it impossible, right? If it said, despite some disagreement about exactly when tribes first lived in the era, then it would be good. But the there means we need to use a word like although prepositionally, okay? Unless doesn't really work here either, all right? So some of them sound fine. Unless and because when you plug them in, they fit, they sound good, but they don't have the right meaning. And then despite has the right meaning, but it doesn't fit the way that this is constructed. Although is the only one that matches both its fit and the meaning for this transition. All right, so question 25 here is a rhetorical synthesis question. It's the first rhetorical synthesis question of our second module. It exploits a very common mistake that the SAT gives for you, a very common trap the SAT gives for you, okay? I'm just going to point out this trap because that's the most important thing. If you miss this for any other reason, you got to study rhetorical synthesis in general. You got to talk to your tutor, talk to your teacher, get better rhetorical synthesis, watch all the videos for all the other rhetorical synthesis questions on this test and every other test. If you miss this, making not the classic error that students make here, you're mistaken in a deeper, more problematic way. However, if you made the simple mistake that almost all the students make who miss this question, you just need to be aware of a common trap that the SAT sets for you, right? So we want to emphasize how CAM plants have adapted to their environment to an audience who doesn't know where these plants are found, okay? So if you chose C, right? CAM plants, how did they adapt? They concentrated CO2 in specialized cells, allowing them to thrive in hot, dry conditions. That sounds really perfect, right? We've read all that. I'm assuming you've read this because you're looking at this question, meaning you've taken this test. You've read this and you see, oh yeah, they talk about plants concentrating CO2 in specialized cells and oh wait. It wasn't CAM plants that do this. It is C4 plants. This is a common SAT distractor. They take an answer choice, it reads perfectly, it uses information from the text, and it just does it in the wrong way, right? It isn't CAM plants, it's C4 plants that reduce water loss through concentrating CO2 in specialized cells. How do CAM plants do that? Well, they do it by opening their stomata at night, right? There we go. That's actually CAM plants. That's not C4 plants. We still get where they live, hot, arid environments. So perfect, right? So if you missed this by selecting C, you're just not, you have to always connect. Is the definition they're giving me the actual definition in the text? This is very similar to the question about exoplanets that we saw on the first module. I believe question 26 on the first module has a very similar error. It might have been 25. Very similar error as this one. The College Board loves to exploit it. Students fall for it often. If you missed this, be cognizant of the fact that this is a thing that the SAT exploits. If you chose A or B, well, you just need to work more on rhetorical synthesis. Watch all our other videos. All right, so 26 is a very classic rhetorical synthesis question here, our next to last question on this test overall. We want to make sure that we have all the parameters we need here. Okay, so what parameters do we need? We need this character, John Ware. We need his importance to Canadian cattle culture and his importance to how we understand cowboy culture in general. Okay, so his overall significance and his specific Canadian significance. All right, so what is his significance overall right here? He's a symbol of diversity and a very skilled cowboy. All right, what is significance in, or his importance in Canada? Well, he's admired in Canada because he helped develop ranching in Western Canada. All right, so these three notes are the ones that we're going to need to pull from, right? If the answer choice doesn't have something from all three of these notes, basically, it's not going to be sufficient. All right, so A, we have a little bit about why he's important today, but is Canada mentioned in A? No, no Canada. So that's only one of two. B, it talks a lot about Canada, and it talks about the fact that he is a legendary black cowboy, but we don't hear contemporary, right? So it talks about his importance to Canada, but not about his importance right now. Okay, so we're missing one of our parameters. C, we have he's a legendary figure in Canada because of what he did to found it, and for how skilled and how he represents a history of diversity in cowboys that are often mistakenly ignored. So C gives both parameters, his importance to Canada and his importance in cowboy culture in general. And then finally, D, we have a lot about Canada, but does it talk about his general importance to cowboy culture? No. So C is the only one that combines all of our parameters. So C is the only one that is correct. All right, so 27 is our final question on this test, final question on module 2 of 300. It's a rhetorical synthesis question. This is an amazing author, Roberto Bolaño. He's funny, he's deep, he's just the greatest ever. He wrote a lot of books. Remember, for questions like this, we can always look at the question first, right, before we read the notes. So we want to introduce the novel 266 to an audience unfamiliar with the author. So what parameters do we need? We need a little bit about who he is and a little bit about the novel itself. So we probably need something from this, right? Here about 266. And we probably need something from this, right? So these notes here and the notes at the end are going to be important. These ones we're not going to need whatsoever, all right? So one thing that is a little bit tricky here, all right? A, we have a lot about 266, right? 2666. But do we have enough about who Roberto Bolaño is? No. So we only have one parameter. B, we learn a bit about who Roberto Bolaño is, right? What kind of writer he is, that he's exiled, etc. But do we learn enough about 266? No, right? C, we learn a little bit about Roberto Bolaño, but do we learn anything about 266 other than the fact that people liked it? No, right? So A, B, and C, neither of those have the proper both parameters. But D, we learn a little bit about Roberto Bolaño and his life, right? And we learn a little bit about 2666, right? We have plot lines and characters across many time periods and continents. We connect them in a way that is a little different from what we see in the notes, but uses information from the notes and synthesizes it, right? That's why we arrived at D. With that, that takes us to the end of the test. Hope you did well.